And thanks to Emilio and Michele for this splendid conference. I can't tell you how my heart leapt when, what now, 6 years ago, something like that, I met Emilio, Roberto and others in the quadrangle at Newcastle University. And they said they were going to have a conference on Gramsci. Gramsci had been the person who'd rescued me as a naive young Marxist long before nearly all of you were born, who had become increasingly disillusioned with Marxism. And it was Gramsci, as the materials become available to read and study him, that had a much greater influence on my own thinking. Now, in fact, what I'm going to talk about is, in a way, footnotes to both Christopher Smith's brilliant lecture, as you'll see, and it also coincides in various ways with Andrea's marvelous collection of material that we've just heard. You may notice that I've taken the word crisis out of the title. That's because, in fact, I want to talk more broadly about the Roman Republic and the creation of a hegemonial narrative. For that first conference, I sought to try and look at how a hegemonial narrative emerged for the autocratic rule of the emperors, and to show how the contribution to that narrative was in part, but in fact, I would argue principally, the creation of the subjects rather than the rulers. That may be overstating it, but that's how I tended to see it. I now want to look at, if you like, at the Republic in somewhat the same light, which may be seen as too extreme. As Christopher finished his marvelous talk with an American allusion, I'm starting with mine, with We the People, because as Christopher pointed out, Rome in some ways is a new creation. The city, the Republic, is a new system. So equally we can study the creation of a new world, a new state, by looking at the history of America, the USA, the creation of the USA, because we have in great detail the arguments and debates that went on about what sort of state they were trying to create. And what I would argue that we can learn from the American model, constitutional model, is that from the very start, there are lines of contestation that are going to run right through the history of the Republic. And they were known to be problematic lines of contestation from the start. For example, very famously, Abigail Adams, the feisty wife of John Adams, not in fact a feminist in any sense, though feminists have tried to recruit her, sent a letter, a famous letter to John Adams saying, "Don't forget the ladies," in dealing with the Constitution, which he took as a joke. It may have been intended as a joke at the time, but that is one split that remains. But of course, the big one is who are the people? And the Declaration of Independence, followed by the Constitution, carefully veered away from settling the problem of slavery and so on, which has been a fault line that has run through, a contested fault line that's run through the whole of the Roman Republic. And what happens is that although a hegemonial narrative, as I would call it, emerges for the United States, it has at certain points a use of language which can be adapted to almost any purpose you want. And I can illustrate that, I think, from recent events. Here is our latest Tribune of the Plebs. And what people may not have noted in the incredible long and convoluted rant he gave on January the 6th is that at some moment dimly came into his mind something of the past. So he was able to imitate Lincoln at Gettysburg. Together we're determined to defend and preserve the government of the people, by the people and for the people, which was being used to sponsor an attack, amongst other things, on his own vice president. which raises fascinating problems. But the interesting thing is that he's using the language that becomes standard within the hegemonial narrative. So in some ways, what I'm dealing with is a prequel, if you like, to the chapter that I did on the Roman emperors. And what if I can move on, behind all this is one of my favorite quotations, favorite works, really, now often forgotten and submerged, but essentially is Gramsci avant la lettre in a way. Etienne de la Boétie in 1574, this wonderful discourse on voluntary servitude, which raises the problem of how on earth do we understand that people voluntarily give themselves up to the power of a single tyrant, and they give him the power because in the end they are able to take it away. Now, you can be skeptical about it if you like, because of course the powers of repression and coercion have so increased in modern states. But I would still say that on the whole, this applies and is true, because in the end, Hitler's Reich doesn't last 1,000 years, Ceausescu gets overthrown and so on. There is some basic truth here that people are in power because the vast majority of people actually are prepared to put up with them and indeed support them in that power. So I believe that Gramsci's concept of a hegemony, of cultural hegemony, and the creation of a hegemonial narrative to explain the world that they're in is absolutely key to our understanding of the Republic. Let's start with this passage of Appian Civil Wars, right at the beginning. Now, what Appian does in this passage is to recognize that the early Roman Republic is full of disputes, of troubles, of problems and decisions, internal discord. But he wants to make a very important distinction. It doesn't bring them to blows until we reach 133 BC in Tiberius Gracchus. There were just disputes and quarrels within the laws. Interestingly, the phrase within the laws, which they settled by making mutual concessions with great respect for each other. Now, obviously, Appian, to some extent, is heavily influenced by Greek philosophical ideas that the ideal state is one in which there's concordia or homonoia, that people, it's a system within which people can agree over things. But nevertheless, he, I believe, is getting at a very distinctive truth about the nature of the development of the Roman Republic. And in a way, the contrast to that would be Machiavelli in the passage which Christopher's already cited, but many will know, the famous passage in Discourse 1 and 4. The Machiavelli's problem, which Christopher dealt with so well and interestingly this morning, was that he sought to use not philosophical sources as such, though he was heavily influenced, of course, by Greek philosophy and so on. And again, I applaud Perdulla's marvelous book of Machiavelli in Tumult, absolutely marvelous book. But that using historical sources to provide parallels for his own society, he had to face up to the fact that there were many disputes and lines of contestation within the Roman Republic. That it was no longer true that small states can grow through concord and that great states can be foiled by discord. One of the most quoted passages amongst humanists in the Renaissance, which curiously is put in the mouth of Micipsa, the king of Numidia, in Sallust's Jugurthine Wars. Now, I think we've got to rethink quite a lot of what we're going to do if we're going to reconstruct the hegemonial narrative of the Roman Republic. as we've seen, as other speakers have dealt with already, there's a tendency to want to see the Roman Republic in transactional terms, the promotion of careers, personal rivalries, provision and benefits to colleagues and clients, rather than the contest between ideologies. This is precisely the matter that Brandon raised. But in my view, the hegemonial narrative of the Roman Republic was always going to be a contested one. And the contested narrative was essentially about what the state is for within the system of the state. Now, the question is, how do we actually look at the state anyhow? And I'm going to be, these are really headlines to something that's going to have to be much more elaborate. The first thing is the distinction between patrician and plebeian has got to disappear from being central to our narrative of the Republic. It is an interesting juridical and significant in its circumstances, juridical distinction that is made. But Roman society is always much more complex than this. And indeed, the issue of whether I'm a plebeian or a patrician is not a central feature of the realities of lives of ordinary Romans, I would suggest. It's there, but it's not a central feature. And indeed, it's important to recognize that Rome, from the start of the Republic, was already one of the biggest city-states in Italy at the time. We need to understand the complexity of that state. One other way of trying to suggest that the world is simple is to say, oh, but it was an agrarian society, which of course it was. But agrarian societies are complex, even very complex indeed. I'll give you a very quick example of that from my own studies of the Roman wine trade, which took up a lot of my life much earlier on in my career. If we think about the production and sale of wine, we're dealing with an estate owner, a middleman who may come and buy you with a team, who may come and buy your grapes on the vine and make wine in your own vats, a merchant who will come to buy it wholesale, a shipper who will seek to ship it, all those involved in port movements, the wholesalers at the destination, the retailers, and so on. There are a lot of people who are involved in this chain that are development who have their own interests. Now, it is true that they do not develop a class identity. That's true. I accept that, but then that is not that different from the situation which Gramsci himself was dealing with in his own history of the Risorgimento in the 19th century Italy. Indeed, what Gramsci was seeing to do was to notice that, in particular, the failure of a revolutionary Jacobin movement to be involved in the creation of modern Italy. And equally, he was heavily influenced by the concept of trasformismo, that process by which the so-called historic parties of the left and right tended to converge in terms of program and thus create a hegemonial narrative, which to some extent, trasformismo remains an influence in Roman politics down to the collapse of the historical parties in the 1990s. So what he's dealing with is a world in which it's not at all clear where decisions are being made or how they're being made. And this is where I come back to a term which we've not discussed much today, which is subalternities, the subalterns. Now, Peter Thomas has, I think, has done a great service to everybody with this very important argument of recalling what Gramsci's actual use of the term subaltern is for and about. It has been hijacked by, with good effects, by a whole generation of scholars who are concerned with emerging societies, third world countries, and so on. And their emphasis is on the exclusion, the idea that we're dealing with the attitudes of a class of subalterns who feel excluded from power and the sources of power and therefore have to argue for it. Peter Thomas argues that Gramsci intended in using the term subaltern in the consideration of 19th century Italy, the subaltern is actually sees himself as being included within the state. As a hegemonic subaltern, it's precisely here, says Thomas, in the midst of a hegemonic relationship constitutively open to contestation, that the potential political power of the subaltern lies. And I notice the political power is very important, or the citizen subaltern, which is the idea that subalternity is not a relation of exclusion from citizenship or full citizenship, but rather one of its forms of its own realization. These people are integrated within the system and are exploiting it for their own ends. And then finally, and I'm going to come back to this, the irrepressible subaltern. This is a great adjective because I think the Roman plebs, if you like, or the subalterns in Roman society are precisely irrepressible subalterns. And to some extent, Andrea has already brought this out in some of what he's been dealing with. The reason for emphasizing the irrepressible subaltern, we can see it obviously in the stories of the secession of the plebs and so on like that, is that this is something that could not be otherwise. The Roman Republican state system did not have the resources or the ability to actually control their citizens. Coercion, which is so often cited as a power of certain magistrates, is, as Nippel has shown long ago, more of an instrument for controlling members of the ruling class than as a means of disciplining the man in the Roman street. It's simply, there are no resources for actually repressing the subalterns. They are irrepressible. And indeed, further, from the Middle Republic onwards, from the time of the Lex Valeria de Provocatione and so on, the citizen is actually protected against arbitrary suppression. So the right to demonstrate, secede, etc., arises not from any permission by the state authorities, but simply from the ability of ordinary people, the subalterns, to actually do it, to actually gather people together and participate. And they participated. I think it arose from something very simple, very basic about the nature of life of Roman citizens. That public opinion as an operative force can be expressed in so many ways in the Roman Republic. Obvagulatio, a hat leg, only use of it which comes in the 12 tables, I'll come on to it in a minute. Flagitatio, the pursuit of individuals to grumble about them, to demonstrate against them. Occentatio, the singing of songs against them. Quiritatio, the appeal to your fellow citizens to come to your aid when you're being oppressed by an individual, and so on. All these are amply demonstrated, as Amy Richlin shows, in the works of Plautus, but they are there in the system anyhow. These are, if you like, a form of charivari, the medieval concept of public demonstration to shame people into acting in a sensible way that is absolutely fundamental, I think, to the lives of ordinary citizens. And of course, then, and Andrea has amply demonstrated this, the theatre as a place for comments by actors, audience, and indeed the playwright. Or indeed a final one, mutatio vestis, the putting on of mourning clothes to demonstrate that you're being oppressed in some way, which has a very interesting variation, which I might come back to, but might as well mention here, in that, of course, this mutatio vestis comes about as a decision of the Senate. It's normally a decree of the Senate to get the Senate to put on to change their dress in some ways. It's somewhat different from these others. But the very important thing here is, I think, is that these systems of people's ability to criticize, to attack, to demand help from fellow citizens and so on, are enshrined in the earliest law codes that we've got. There's the two controversial passages from the 12 tables. To one, whoever shall have been lacking a witness, if you can't persuade person to come as a witness to him, he's to go every other day to complain in the entrance passage, to obvagulatio. And obvagulatio is glossed by Festus to mean to complain with criticism. So it's becomes enshrined in law that people are able to do this, yes, for legal purposes, but it simply recognizes a practice that is there. Now, it might be argued that they also sought to control it, because in 12 Table 8, we have whoever casts a magic spell or whoever sings in enmity or compose a song implies that occentatio might imply, some people have sought to limit it because of the talk about casting a magic spell, but in fact I think it is quite general, meant to be a way of limiting unfounded abuse. It becomes eventually subsumed under the law of inuria in the Roman Republic. However, much later in the digest, we get the extraordinary thing that it is not reasonable to condemn a person who defames a person who is guilty of what is claimed. It's both right and reasonable for the misdeeds of guilty parties to be known. So it's recognized that this is a perfectly good system. Now, I must hasten on, I've not got far to go with these things. One of the other things is that obviously we need to look at tribunes, but I'm not going to look at tribunes because I know it's going to come up later in this conference. But one thing that I would say about tribunes is that the tribunate should not be seen as a state within a state. The secessions of the plebs and the tribunes should not be seen as a state in a state. They only make sense as being part of a system, as being part of this system, an integration of the people, of ordinary people, into the system to give them a role within the system. And I think that's very important. Now, can I very, very quickly, if you look at that first passage of Livy 332 that I've got here, we need to look at the processes of the way in which people could respond to actions by the subaltern groups. And I'll give you just one little example, which is there is much difficulty with the account of the plebs taking over, making public the land of the Aventine area in the 450s, because it's supposed to be associated with a lex Aequilia, but Aequilius is a tribune. There's all sorts of problems with the status of it. Dionysius of Halicarnassus has a very complex way of trying to solve that. He recognizes the problem, but he can't solve it. But the reality is that the truth may, as Tim Cornell has pointed out, lie in Livy 332, which is that there was general agreement to the appointment of the patrician decemviri in 452 on condition that the Aequilian law about the Aventine and other leges secretae should be abrogated. In other words, what's the actual takeover of the Aventine had no legal thing other than the fact that plebs swore an oath to support each other. It was a physical takeover. But they then negotiate the acceptance of that within the system. And I think this is a very important thing. And indeed, Livy, in general terms, again, as Christopher has, and we won't, suggests a route by which people should be prepared to compromise always with authority. I want to finish with one area of contestation which needs to be set out, which is the battle between res publica and res privata. Cicero, in a very, very famous passage in De Officiis, those who want to be populares by agrarian laws or money loan remitted for the borrowers actually undermine the whole basis of the Republic, and indeed Concordia, which cannot exist where money is taken from one party and imposed upon another. Aequitas is removed if everybody's not allowed to have what is actually his. Curiously, Livy has a direct counter to that, that faction and respect for private property has always and always will obstruct public decisions. That's the debate, that Cicero's insistence that what's private is private, it then renders impossible any sensible solution to a problem that is inherent in agrarian societies. Credit and debt are absolutely vital to agrarian societies. And they were solved in various ways throughout the Republic by intermittent cancellation of debts, which is the normal way to go, which means that people's res privata has to contribute to the rest of the state, the needs of the whole population. What we've got here, and what I've tried to suggest, is that in my view, we, ages ago, essentially someone who sees history in transactional terms, Fergus Miller's my old friend Fergus Miller, long ago argued that there was a strong democratic element within Roman Republican society. I want to suggest that that is even more deep set and more fundamental, that the plebs actually created, the subaltern groups and society actually play the major role in the creation of the Roman Republic as it is at its height. Of course, that leaves carefully avoiding the issue of what happened in the last century BC, but there lies another tale. Thank you.